Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 4 of a series focused on compliance policy in Microsoft Intune, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. The focus of today's discussion will be conditional access. And it's an interesting topic because conditional access we're talking about in relation to compliance policy. We'll definitely demonstrate that and point that out as we go through, but we can't really just talk about conditional access in relation to compliance policy because conditional access is a lot more than that. So we're not going to dig into the other things greatly, but I am going to talk about them a little bit as we go through. So here's the agenda for our discussion. First, what is conditional access and why do we care? Then we'll want to talk about the requirements for conditional access, see how it works, a couple of scenarios perhaps for conditional access. Then I'm going to show you how to configure conditional access, basically a walkthrough of conditional access in the console, and then we'll see it work. We'll wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks. Okay, so what is conditional access? Basically, conditional access is a component of Azure AD that can be used to define organizational policies for access to your data. So yes, it's a component of Azure AD. Intune will leverage, tie in, contribute to conditional access through the compliance stuff that we've been talking about so far through this series. In terms of defining the organizational policies, one of the things to always keep in mind in this world that we live in today with cloud services and remote workers and different things, we used to think about the security boundary for our organization as being within our organizational network, and that is no longer the case. The security boundary now extends to include workers that may be located lots of places, right? On the corporate network, outside the corporate network, using devices that are delivered by IT, that sometimes using devices that aren't delivered by IT. And conditional access helps define the policies based on device status, requirements to access corporate data, and so on, as you'll see. It's a series of access controls, right? Essentially, conditional access is a gatekeeper to determine whether or not a device or user gets access to corporate data based on conditions you set up. Another word for conditions, signals, right? There's a number of signals that you can configure in conditional access that you'll see. Things from user group membership to IP location, where the device and or user is located. Certain applications on the device type itself, and the device status itself. Real-time and calculated detection methods that it sounds pretty generic, and I get it, but it's out there. And then being able to decide based on cloud app security and additional details at that level. Again, we're not going to touch in great detail on any of those. We're going to focus our discussion primarily on compliance and device compliance and pull that into this discussion. But as I mentioned, conditional access far bigger than just compliance. So why do we care? Again, enforced access requirements, making sure that as devices, as users are attempting to access corporate data, that they do so in a secure way, right? That whole discussion of the modern security perimeter now extending beyond the corporate network is a big reason why conditional access. Allowing conditional access to be that gatekeeper that will either block or allow access to that data is centerpiece, right? So what are the requirements for conditional access? Well, it's really pretty easy. You either have access to conditional access or you don't. You do need Azure AD Premium or M365 Business Premium to be able to access conditional access in your tenant. And then from there, you can configure it and start to use it the way that benefits your organization, right? So how does this really work, right? So here's a diagram that's in our documentation that I'm pulling to kind of give a visual of what happens. So basically you have a device out here and you have certain you have conditional access policy. There's certain signals that are coming in, maybe detail from the device or user and where the user is located, certain applications that are on the device. any real-time risk that might be happening. And so that all together, those signals are coming together, and the attempt is being made to access corporate data, right? And so conditional access sits in the middle to either allow access, block access based on the combination of things that it's seeing from that access request, require MFA, right? So if you do want to allow access, that's fine, but you can add the additional level of requiring multi-factor authentication for that access to go forward. And then once you satisfy all those requirements, finally, that device, that user gets access to the corporate data that they want, right? So we could go on and on for scenarios about conditional access, the way companies use conditional access. Boiled it down to two. Corporate data, right? Being able to secure access to corporate data. That's corporate workers, but it's not just corporate workers anymore, right? Again, we live in this scenario where workers from whatever company that we need to work with might need to access our data. And so trusted outside entities can be provisioned to be able to access your corporate data and leverage conditional access to do that. Remote employees, at the time that I'm recording this in the middle of COVID, that's a big, big deal for companies across the world, right? And kind of for those companies that had not yet thought about extending their security boundary and really were still doing things on-prem, this really changes that discussion, and organizations have to think about the remote workers like they never have had to before, and think about extending their security boundary, and think about, hey, what are the devices that are going to be used to access corporate data? Is it only corporate devices still? Is it personal devices, right? Any device could be used, any location could be in play, and regardless of all of that, you want to make sure that access to that corporate data is secure, is what you want it to be, right? Okay, so all of that said, let's just jump into this and start to configure and at least walk through the configuration of conditional access, right? So I'm going to start in the Endpoint Manager console. Under Devices, if I scroll down, there is a node for conditional access. Sorry, I passed it. Go scroll up here. Here's conditional access, right? So conditional access is one of those things that is an Azure AD thing. But because Intune administrators will want to be able to get in and configure conditional access in some cases, we'll go ahead and put this shortcut link in the Endpoint Manager console so that you can get to conditional access here, right? So what you see is going to be the same as if I were to go access this, the configurations, if I go access this directly, right? So we have some policies already in play, right? So these are built-in policies, right, that you can learn from, that you can look at. Here's one that I'll use in the demo in just a minute. For now, I'm just going to go create a new policy. And immediately what we're going to be presented with are a series of questions, right? So control user access based on conditional access policy to bring the signals together, just like I talked about. You can name it, so I'll just give it a name because I'm not going to save this one. And then as I scroll down, I start to see options, right? Assignments. So there's assignments, there's access controls. And so there's a bunch of things here. So users and groups. So I can blow this out and I can go ahead and define what users and or groups I want to apply this particular conditional access policy to. So maybe I want all users, or maybe I have a select list of users that I want to be in groups, perhaps, that I want to apply this to, whatever. And so notice also the warning at the bottom, right? Make sure not to lock yourself out. You can if you configure your policy incorrectly, right? And so this is where you'll see in our documentation the idea of having an exclusion for this policy. So if you do configure conditional access policy in a way that is incorrect and ends up locking yourself out, you want to have what's called a break glass or an emergency kind of account that can go restore. And so that would be in the exclusion list, right? You can go exclude certain groups, and that group would be one that contains the account that is that emergency account, right? So you define it there. So I don't have anyone selected, but that's where you define it, right? Okay, so this is all about defining users, groups, same kind of deal on the what it applies to, whatever, right? So fairly straightforward. I'll just say all users to pass for now. And then the next one is cloud apps or actions, right? So do I want to do, and by the way, you don't have to configure every single one of these nodes. It's really up to you and what you want to do. For example, if you don't want to apply this conditional access policy to any cloud apps, great, you don't have to configure anything here. If you want to include cloud apps, then you'll have to say, hey, do all cloud apps. Again, don't lock yourself out. It is possible, right? Or selected apps, right? Apps that are out there, and we'll show you the list of cloud apps that you can choose from here and select, right? There's quite a number. If you have certain cloud apps that you do want to exclude, then you could just select all the ones you want here, or you could specifically exclude certain cloud apps from a policy out here, whatever you need to have done. Same list of the cloud apps that we had in the include part. Then there's conditions, right? Now notice on the condition side, there's a lot of things here. There's quite a few that pop out here that we can choose from. The top one, user risk. So this is in preview. User risk is basically, is Azure identifying this particular logon as a high-risk logon and needs to be excluded, right? Configure that, yes or no. Sign-in risk. Same kind of deal, right? Is this being identified as a high-risk sign-on for various reasons? And again, I'm glossing over these on purpose. This is not detailing each one of these. We will stop and focus on the compliance stuff in a minute, but just showing these to you. You can apply by device platform. So do I want to configure this? Yes. I can select what particular device platform that this conditional access policy would apply to. So if there's certain Android, as example, devices out there that you might want to have a different kind of conditional access profile for, you can do that here. If you want to do something unique to Windows, you can do that here. If there's certain exclusions that you want to put in place, you can do that here, right? No problem. If there's certain locations that none of your users will ever need to log in from, you can configure that, right? Now, or it may be that there's certain locations that if the user is logging in, I'm not sure why that's not blowing out right there, let's see, is logging in from, you want to treat it differently, then you can certainly do that, right? Let's go back to that. Interesting. Oh, there we go. Control user access based on their location and so on, right? Here's where you would go down and configure that one. That's where it popped up, right? Okay. And then also I can go to client apps. And so here's where I would configure, do I want to control client apps? And client apps is not cloud apps. This is actual apps that are on the device. So things that might use modern authentication, your browser, your mobile apps, desktop clients, right? Any legacy authorized clients, Exchange ActiveSync, other things, right? There's a lot that you can actually dig into and do here. And then finally, this one is in preview, device state. So here's where we'll slow down. I'm not actually going to use this in the demo. You'll see what I'll use in the demo in just a minute. But basically, if I decide to include this, I can say, hey, do I want to include all device states, or do I want to exclude whenever certain device states are out there, such as device hybrid Azure AD joined, device marked as compliant. So there's one of our places that we can use compliance as a part of conditional access and this particular rule to define whether or not the device state actually is a part of things, right? Whether the device the user is signing in from is hybrid Azure AD joined or marked as compliant can be a big deciding factor for allowing access, right? Okay, and then once we define all of our policies, let me go get rid of that. Once we define all of our policies and assign them, then we make decisions based on those policies and maybe other things. So, access control. I can decide to grant control or block control, right, based on different things. So I can decide grant access based on a number of things. Require multi-factor authentication, if I put a check box there. Notice this one, require device to be marked as compliant. So this is one that I am using in my demo policy that you'll see here in a minute. Require the device to be joined to hybrid Azure AD, require approved client apps, and on we go, right? So a bunch of choices in here. I have session access controls if I want to use those, right? Control user access based on session controls. And so on. So that's really showing you the main things that I want to show you. Again, very, very, very high level. I get it. We're not digging into all of these settings. We're really focused on compliance, but you can't really talk about conditional access without at least showing the kinds of options that you have to be able to control access. Okay, so that said, let's actually go forward and see this work. So back in the console, I want to show you the specific policy that I'm going to use. But before I do that, let me get rid of this and kind of lay the scenario out a little bit. So if I go back to devices and then go to Windows devices here, I have a couple of Windows devices, right? One of them is compliant with my compliance policy. One of them is not. So the device that is compliant, notice that it is not co-managed. It is only Intune managed, which means that only the Intune compliance policies are applied to the device, which is a very fair scenario and one that's pretty easy for me to use and demo. The other device is from the previous session, session 3, where we are combining Intune and Configuration Manager conditional access policy, and Config Manager policy is causing that device to be seen as not compliant, right? So those are the two devices I'm going to show you. Now, let me go back to devices, and I'm going to go back into conditional access and show you the specific policy that I do have defined. So scrolling down, you'll see here's my demo conditional access policy. And looking at this, first of all, you can define the policy all day, but until you turn it on, it's not going to do anything, right? So, and that's actually a good thing because you can go configure these, tweak them, double check, double look at it before you turn it on and potentially lock yourself out, which also means go test this, first if you have a demo tenant, hopefully. Go test this there before we go try to implement it in production, but mine is enabled. So I have a couple of things configured, right? So first of all, cloud apps or actions. I am enabling selected apps, and the one I'm using is Office 365 for this demo, right? None of the other ones, all I care about is access to mail for this particular demo. The conditions that I'm setting are a couple, right? So again, you see I'm not assigning everything. So in terms of device platforms, I am saying yes, configure, and I'm saying select device platforms. And the only one that I'm choosing right now is Windows, and I also chose Mac OS. There's no Macs in this demo, but just to show you, again, you don't have to define all of them. And then on the exclude tab, I'm not excluding anything. I'm just not explicitly including Android, iOS, or Windows Phone. And then in terms of client apps, there are 3 things that I'm going to configure here. Mobile apps and desktop clients, and then these legacy pieces as well. So that's all configured, right? And then in terms of access controls, well, first of all, notice that I'm not using anything under device state for determining access, right? There is the ability to use a compliance check with device state. I'm just not choosing to do it. Instead, for access, I'm granting access only when the device is compliant. That's the only gatekeeper that I have here to set that up, right? Okay, and so we close that and scroll down, and you'll see there's nothing else here, right? So that is my entire conditional access policy. So let's get this out of the way. And so what I'm going to do is start with my compliant device, right? So let's go ahead and pull my compliant device onto the screen. Hopefully I'll remember it. Yeah, this one. All right, so let's get this out here, log in. And so what I've done is installed Outlook on this, and I'm just going to try to log in or set up Outlook and tie in a given account so that I can access mail, right? So let me find Outlook. There it is. So let's just open that up. Okay. Here it comes. Great. So now I'm going to try to just go ahead and set this up manually as soon as it gets done, trying to search for accounts. And so now I'm going to type in my alias. So this is just my Tailspin Toys account. There we go. And I'm going to connect with that account. And so it's going to go out and look, and there's some mail out there for this account, and we'll see if we get through, right? Okay, so good enough. Now I'm going to just choose Outlook, so we're getting things ready, adding that through, see what happens. So I'm to the next screen now, no problem. Let's just go forward and click next, and done. Good enough. So now I have access to Outlook. Go away, sorry. Go away. Okay, so let Outlook continue to load. And so we're loading Outlook and going and retrieving our settings. Let's see what happens. Loading, configuring, receiving, and now we're in. I have to accept the license agreement, but effectively we are in to Outlook, right? No problem at all. So here's mail. You'll see other, maybe you definitely see that there's mail here. It finally came down. So all good, no problem at all. We are good to go. So that is the one that is compliant in the Intune console. What about the one that is not compliant in the Intune console? Well, let's open that one up and take a look at it for a second and do the same thing and see what happens. So pulling that VM onto the screen. So this is -8. All right, good enough. Sign in. Sign in. Waiting for it to sign in. There we go. All right, cool. Let's go launch Outlook. Same as before. Right here. Right, and so now we'll do the same thing. So we're going to go try to configure a user account. And so same account. Okay, so let's go forward, connect. So it's going to go process and try to add me to Outlook and spin around the circle for a minute and see, let's see what happens. All right, and so same screen, let's go to Outlook.com, says we're getting things ready. Let's see what's going to happen. Processing, and here we go, right? Conditional access says, wait a minute, you're trying to access Outlook, but your device is not compliant. So you can't do that yet, right? There's something wrong with this connection, and you're not allowed to access Outlook like you want to, right? So again, pretty simple demos, but demos that are really illustrative of the power of just compliance, right? So we haven't factored in any really of the other checks in conditional access. We're factoring in compliance. So, but just with compliance, big deal in terms of being a gatekeeper for whether or not you want to be able to access corporate data. Okay, so troubleshooting tips and tricks. So just a couple of things here, right? So as we want to troubleshoot things, again, conditional access is part of Azure. And so I'm not going to dig in deeply. I'm just going to mention this, right? And then we'll move on. But in Azure, you do have the ability to go into the Azure portal. You can go into Azure Active Directory. You can see some sign-in detail. You can dig into the conditional access detail there and really be able to leverage that to understand what's going on with a given sign-in. Was the sign-in allowed? Was it blocked? Is there a reason that it was blocked? Is it a conditional access reason? And we can drill in that section to understand a bit more as to why a sign-in block may have happened. And then just some tips and tricks. You know, as you go through and look at this kind of is in the troubleshooting arena too, but there are some error codes that you'll see related possibly to conditional access. And so here's a list of what they are and what they mean. And so if you encounter them, at least you can help interpret what they mean and so on, right? And so really that's it. That's what I wanted to show you. In terms of conditional access today, session doesn't take a great deal of time to go through these topics, but the power of conditional access is huge. So we will wrap up this session here. I would encourage you to go take a look at conditional access. It really can be a really important cog in the wheel of making sure you maintain security in your environment. So again, we'll wrap it up here, and we will see you next time.